Pattaya City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Phil Robertson. I'm the Deputy Asia Director for Human Rights Watch. It's actually very difficult to follow a presentation like that because you actually see what is actually happening from the perspective of a specific village in a specific place in a generally remote corner of Myanmar. You also see the sort of exceptional things that one person can do to try to alleviate in a little bit the suffering that people are facing. And it's worth considering, you know, when you look around in your daily lives in Pattaya, that many of the people that you probably see, you may not even realize that are from Myanmar. You know, there's as many as 4 million migrant workers from Myanmar in Thailand. That's a lot when you consider the overall population of the country is about 50 million. And all those people are facing the same kind of anxiety, the same kind of stress, the same kind of pressure to somehow contribute back to a very difficult situation where relatives are, in some cases, losing houses, in some cases have had to flee into the jungle or have had to flee to other places, and where people are being kidnapped and killed. So, you know, it's people sort of say, oh, well, Myanmar is a long way away. It's far, it's across this border. It's actually right here among us every day, and it's important to remember that and think about that. I want to thank Ren for inviting me again, and to the leadership of the club for having me back to talk to you about what's happening in Myanmar. And actually, that's a very popular Twitter hashtag for people among you who might spend some time on Twitter. If you look at hashtag what's happening in Myanmar, you will find that there are thousands and thousands of daily updates and tweets from people all over Myanmar happening every day. And the interesting thing is that before the February 1st, 2021 coup, no one paid attention to Twitter in Myanmar at all. It was almost like, what is Twitter? You know, everybody's on Facebook, everybody's paying attention there, but no one's paying any attention to Twitter. And there's just been an explosion of use of Twitter since that February 1st, 2021 coup. And part of that, I think, is because people want to have their voices heard about what's happening to them. And the interesting thing about Twitter is that you don't have to sign up with your real name. So it's anonymous. So people can actually say what they think, and they can retweet things, and they can give their opinions. And so it's very interesting that, you know, that's just a sidebar, that, you know, people really are very keen about telling the world about what's happening to them and trying to seek assistance. Now, some of you may know Human Rights Watch, the organization I work with. We are one of the leading global human rights organizations. We regularly work and speak out about human rights issues in over 100 different countries around the world. You know, our work stretches back to the 1980s, and in Burma, as many still call the country, we actually started investigating abuses in that country back in 1988 during the first modern democracy uprising against military rule. And we do work in a lot of different places, and these places are in the news every day. You know, there are rights abuses really that are rampant in some of these places: Syria, Iraq, Ethiopia, Sudan, now Ukraine. But in Asia, I can say that nowhere has been keeping us busier than Burma. And so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happening in Myanmar, and then look forward to hearing questions from you afterwards. Now, the country Myanmar, or Burma as I often call it, and I can explain in the Q&A why there are two names. It's often one question I get, is one of the clearest, most tragic, and most horrible setback on human rights in the region. If you want to talk about a country that looked like it had finally gotten its act together, although it was not perfect, that would be Burma. And now it's all been dashed, it's all been dragged back to square one. To make a long story short, after a November 2020 national election, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, it should be said, that saw a remarkably high turnout, again showing people's dedication to democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy, or NLD, party won a landslide victory. International election observers, including those from the European Union, noted that, yeah, there were some problems, but that broadly the election was generally free and fair. Nothing undue had occurred that would call into the question the massive landslide election victory that the NLD had won. And once again, the political parties that had been backed by the Burmese military, which is known as the Tatmadaw, had been crushed. The military leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and his minions complained that there was massive cheating in the election, but they had no evidence. And most observers noted that actually the senior general had made no secret of his desire to be president of Myanmar, a sort of step up that he wanted to add in addition to continuing his control of the armed forces. So many people attributed his complaints to sour grapes and proceeded with the process of the transition. And the transition between election and a new government in Myanmar usually takes a little bit more than 2 months. But the senior general would not let it go. Tensions continued to rise between him and the military on one side, and Suu Kyi and the NLD on the other. Rumors of a coup began circulating, but most people, me included, discounted that because we thought it's going to be so disastrous. It's, how could they possibly do that? And besides, we thought the Tatmadaw already has a pretty good deal. There's a sort of two-headed arrangement that existed in Myanmar with civilians in charge of some things and the military in charge of other things. And it's worth noting that per the 2008 Constitution, which was a constitution written by the military for the military, the Tatmadaw automatically got 25% of seats in the parliament. 25% of seats right off the top. Their budget is off the books, meaning there's no civilian review. So whatever they want, they get. Serving military men are the only ones who can be ministers of the most powerful three ministries: the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Border Affairs. And actually any sort of issue that they deemed to involve national security was off limit to civilians. So, it was a pretty cushy deal. It seemed to be pretty good. And most of us thought that Senior General Min Aung Hlaing was just complaining again because he wanted to negotiate for something more. But he surprised us all by rolling out the tanks in early morning hours of February 1st, 2021, just as the new parliament was about to convene. Parliamentarians were all put under house arrest. State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint were arrested, and claims were made that it was all because of a still completely unsubstantiated claims of election cheating by the NLD. And so it was said, okay, the military caretaker government would hold power and then would organize a new election, which was promised for sometime in 2023. Let me say as a side here, as an American, I can say there's something very Trump-like in all of this. Losing an election, screaming at the other side, cheated, providing documents, which they published in the Global Lunite of Myanmar, their mouthpiece, but no real evidence of wrongdoing, and then threatening violence. The difference is General Min Aung Hlaing was the head of a military that is used to holding absolute power and obeying orders without question. So actually, I bet Donald Trump wished that he had had what Min Aung Hlaing has. Fortunately, he doesn't. And so thus, the Tatmadaw ended a 10-year experiment with the restoration of democracy in Burma that had seen the return of basic civil and political rights for most people, including access to internet for the first time. And core freedoms like freedom of expression, to say what you want, association, to associate with people you want, as we're doing here today, and peaceful public assembly. After the coup, the internet was cut temporarily, and everybody was supposed to sort of sit at home and take it. That was what was expected. That was what had happened previously. There had been protests, but when there was a crackdown, people went home. At least that was the Tatmadaw's plan. And actually, for the first couple days after February 1st, as the shock to the Burmese people sank in that once again they were facing military rule, it was generally quiet. And it appeared that maybe the Tatmadaw's plan might work. But the coup makers had severely underestimated the Burmese people, and particularly the entire new generation of Burmese who grew up with mobile phones in their hands, able to get news from around the world, that had gotten used to a more open society where they could speak their minds and generally do what they wanted. And where also, importantly, the economy was improving. Because from 2011 to 2021, Burma had changed significantly. From a country that had virtually no mobile phones in 2010, except the few elites. And I think the mobile phone cost was something like $10,000 a mobile phone. It was ridiculous. Now everyone had one. And the freedom to see news, share views, express opinions, good, bad, and sometimes ugly. Foreign investment had poured into the country, connecting the Myanmar economy to the world, and created sustained growth, at least in the country's major cities, and new opportunities for a lot of people. Higher education had reopened, with students finally attending classes. 2 generally free and fair elections had taken place in 2015 and 2020, both won decisively by the NLD. Media freedom had flourished, with hundreds of newspapers, online websites, TV and radio stations reporting the news. The police and army informer networks, they still existed, but the fear that they had perpetrated previously in the tea shops and wider society during the military dictatorships of yesteryear, those are gone as people exercise their right to speak out. And now, all of a sudden, the younger generation faced the situation that their parents and grandparents had talked about the control, the time when the Burmese military had been in control during the previous generations, during the SLORC and SPDC military governments, and about the nighttime arrests, and the torture in custody, and the other abuses people faced during those years. For the older people, of course, it was obviously a return to their greatest fear, their greatest nightmare. A return to the dark ages of military rule, which they thought they had finally escaped. And in fact, I would argue that the 2015 and 2020 elections, which were so overwhelmingly supporting the NLD, were not just about the actual popular support for Aung San Suu Kyi, which there certainly is, and particularly amongst the ethnic Burmans, who compose 65% of the population. But I think it was also people voting for a big party that they saw would be a bulwark against the return of military rule. They were worried that if they had fractious small parties, lots of small parties, that it would be easier for the military to come back. Unfortunately, they underestimated the military. But the military also underestimated the Burmese people, and what happened next was unexpected and has really changed Myanmar for the good. Starting with the nightly protests, really around February 5th and 6th, people started banging pots and pans. Like banging pots and pans. I mean, you can see the videos. I mean, the entire city of Yangon at 8 p.m. is banging pots and pans. And the reason is that was a traditional practiced to scare away bad spirits. So it was in the realm of the symbolic, as well as a demonstration of solidarity that people were opposed to this military coup. And that more rapidly morphed into a massive protest movement, where literally millions of people took to the streets all across Myanmar in February and early March 2021 to peacefully protest and say, we don't want the coup, we don't want military rule, restore our democracy, return our elected leaders, of course, who were all under arrest, and respect our human rights. And that started with doctors and nurses, and spread rapidly other groups, including teachers, and this morphed into what was a massive civil disobedience movement, or CDM. This was formed and it refused to support the government or work with the government, work in government offices. Doctors walked out of hospitals and set up their own private clinics. Teachers stopped teaching. People refused to pay taxes. People refused to pay public utility bills. And basically organized what could be termed as a mass strike. That mass strike is still continuing. And these mass strike tactics are all about withholding any sort of economic support for the military government. And that has also included boycotts of various different goods and products that are associated with the military. And the junta was stunned, at least temporarily. They didn't expect that there would be this massive outpouring of protest. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and the State Administration Council coup group thought that this was going to be easy. They thought that people might protest a little bit and then they would accept. And just like Vladimir Putin underestimated the resistance of the Ukrainian people, so too did Min Aung Hlaing underestimate the determination of the Burmese people to defend their rights and their democracy. But the pause, the stunned effect that the military had was really rather brief. And the military quite quickly reverted back to its more brutal form. It started to send police into the streets, gradually started using tear gas and rubber bullets against protesters, then later live ammunition. And then the military showed its hand and came out shooting. And meanwhile, the whole machinery of repression, the nighttime arrests, the torture, the deaths in custody, kicked into gear, trying to identify and imprison the leaders of the CDM. As of yesterday, May 3rd, Bo Ji, who leads a group called the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners and has been keeping track of statistics, say that 1,806 people have been killed by the security forces since February 1st last year. A total of 10,517 people are currently arrested and under detention. 1,039 have been actually sentenced to prison, including 65 who have been sentenced to death. There's another 1,977 who are evading arrest warrants, who are on the run. 120 people have been sentenced in absentia, including 41 sentenced to death. So there is a massive system of repression now operating that is killing, arresting, imprisoning people. By the way, these figures from Burma are by far and away the worst in the region. When I talk about the region, I mean Southeast Asia. No one else even comes close. Vietnam has over 250 political prisoners. Cambodia has maybe up to 100. Thailand has actually charged 1,600 protesters with various different offenses, but most of them are out on bail. In some cases, are still protesting. But in Myanmar, it's off the charts. And actually, as the police and military cracked down in Myanmar, in some cases, we saw military units being sent into the cities that had been accused of past atrocity crimes against the Shan, against the Rohingya, against other ethnic minorities in various hinterlands. But something different happened as that happened. We'd seen in the past democracy uprisings in 1988 and the rising of the monks in 2007, that when a crackdown took place, people fled. And there might be some existing small protests, but it slowly petered out. But actually, what has happened this time around is that people have resisted and fought back. And in the early days, as the police and the military were coming out onto the streets, protesters were organizing barricades. And it was really David versus Goliath. I mean, you had military and police firing live ammunition against protesters who had makeshift shields and helmets, firing bottle rockets and Roman candles, basically fireworks back at the military, and using slingshots in some case. What we've also seen is that an opposition government composed of a National League for Democracy representatives, leaders of various ethnic groups, and also civil society activists has been created. And it's operating both in exile as well as inside Burma. It's called the National Unity Government of Myanmar, or NUG for short. And they've done a lot of things. They've deemed the coup illegal, declared the 2008 constitution null and void, and have promised a new political order for Myanmar based on a federal government. And without going too far into the depths of political organization in Myanmar, suffice to say that it's so ethnically diverse that the claim for the ethnic groups has always been, let's have a federal government where we all have an equal say in the government, and it's not dominated by the center, by a unity government led by Burmans. And so this is sort of the new promise of this NUG, that there's going to be a different political order if they win. We'll see if it actually plays out or not, but that is the promise. And as violence against protesters further intensified, forcing protesters ultimately to abandon those barricades, on September 7th, 2021, the NUG declared a people's revolution and a quote-unquote defensive war, and announced the formation of People's Defense Forces, or PDFs, to carry out the fight against the military and police. Specifically, NUG Chair Interim President Dui Lashila called for numerous branches of the PDF militias and armed ethnic groups to target military and support the pillars to take control of their regions, and urging all levels of local administration to stop working immediately. So basically what you have now is the beginning of a civil war. And that's where we are now. We're in a phase of deepening violence across the country between the PDFs and the ethnic armed armies on one hand versus the military and police. And that has included not only fighting in the hinterlands, but also attacks in major cities. The PDFs, they're using IEDs. There's been targeted assassinations. Every day I get a sort of a security brief of the various different incidences. 10 or 15 people are being killed every day, being arrested by the authorities, but also you have people who are supporters of the police or military being targeted as well with assassinations. So there's a tug of war now going on between the military leaders and their forces versus the people. The government has the upper hand in the ability to use violence and inspire terror, through these nightly raids and arrests, as well as the torture and military interrogation centers. But the people have their economic weapons, they have the mass strike, they have the boycotts, and increasingly they have the PDFs, which are striking back violently against the military and the police. And this tug of war, I think, will take a while. We may be in this for a couple years. But I think that generally time is on the side of the people, and that while there will certainly be lots more suffering and tragically lost lives, the people will prevail. The international community has a role to play in supporting the people's cause and hurrying that day of victory, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Quite clearly, however, from the perspective of a human rights group, we have to say that the Myanmar junta has committed crimes against humanity, against the people. There are systematic and severe abuses happening every day. You saw some photos amongst what Rose showed you, those. I mean, we see those all the time. And they're not just occurring in one area or another, and they're not occurring just by one military or police commander or another, but they're occurring across the country. We've seen massacres in Karenni State, in towns and villages across Sagaing Division, in Chin State and elsewhere. And these atrocities are actually reinforcing what we've always known, that the Tatmadaw will have no hesitation in using deadly force against anyone it encounters when it goes into the field, and that it practices scorched earth tactics against villages and settlements, and often kills anybody unfortunate enough to be caught by troops as they conduct their so-called quote-unquote clearance operations. We've seen indiscriminate use of aerial bombardments, including some very close to the Thai border in Karen State. We've seen bombing of churches, schools, hospitals, and villages without any regard for civilians. We've seen artillery used to shell areas, villages where the Tatmadaw believes that perhaps there are PDFs or ethnic groups operating, but you know, they don't bother to try to go find those people. They just shell the area. You know, and of course we've also seen a return to tactics of the past, which is that the Myanmar military has returned to using rape as a weapon of war against the country's ethnic minorities. There were a number of reports that have documented attacks against the Shan, the Karenni, the Karen, and others. I mean, there's a whole a library bookshelf of these reports that you can find. And then, once again, we're seeing this happening. And as I mentioned, you know, the military coup has stopped 10 years of significant economic growth and progress that happened during the democratic period in Myanmar. You know, Myanmar was starting to catch up with some of its neighbors in ASEAN. And the junta's actions have slammed the gears of the economy into reverse. There is no doubt that there is diminishing support for the military junta. Foreign investors are heading for the door. International chambers of commerce in Yangon are bemoaning the junta's policies. The junta has now actually just shot itself in the foot by saying that any money that is brought into the country needs to be converted into the Myanmar kyat within one day that it's brought in at the rate that the military sets, which is going to make it virtually impossible for international business to do business in that country and maintain compliance with the law. There are two major conglomerates, the Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited and the Myanmar Economic Corporation, which are both controlled by the military. And these have been subject to sanctions and boycotts. Sanctions primarily by the United States, European Union, Canada, and Britain. And a number of big companies have headed out the door, including Total Energies of France, Kirin Beer of Japan, and others. But I will say there is an enormous sense, as I've been working on Myanmar since really 1993, of sort of disastrous deja vu about what is going on here. You know, with the worst excesses of the Myanmar military coming back. And actually, as I've been talking to my Burmese friends, they said the same thing, that, you know, it feels like we've done this before. It feels like we fought for democracy and won, and now we have to do it all over again. We fought against rights abuses before, and we have to do it all over again. You know, and this military is once again using the same sort of tactics that they've used in the past. The military, the Tatmadaw, uses what they call the four cuts doctrine of warfare. This was brought up by the original military dictator, General Ne Win, and basically it cuts off insurgents from funding, food, intelligence, and recruits. It's actually based in part by Britain's brutal tactics during the Malaya emergency. In Tatmadaw terms, this is best recognized by an approach that could be described as kill all, burn all, and destroy all. I mean, basically shooting anyone who flees. We have a symphony on the corner over here. Yeah. Basically shooting anyone who flees an area, detaining and torturing men and boys in the area, sometimes because they think they can get information from them, sometimes because they think that they're insurgents, sexually harassing and raping women, shelling, bombarding, and destroying villages and homes, including schools, medical clinics, churches, and other clearly humanitarian sites, looting whatever they can find, because actually the Tatmadaw is a sort of live off the land kind of army. The ground soldiers are not well paid. Much of the resources are dominated by the officers. They don't share. And so basically, when they go into the field, they'll steal anything that's not locked down. It reminds me in some of what the stories we've been reading from Ukraine, as the Russian soldiers were pulling out of some of the suburbs of Kyiv, basically taking anything they could. And they have been seizing and using people for forced labor, including them to porter supplies in war zones, as Rose mentioned in one case. In some cases, using them as human shields. Actually going in with a column and putting villagers out front so they don't get ambushed. This is the sort of thing that the military does. And we're seeing this time and time again. We're seeing more and more massacres. We've been just documenting the case of a massacre that happened on Christmas Eve in Karenni State, where the Tatmadaw set up a checkpoint on a road as people were fleeing fighting in other areas. This was in Pruso Township, near Loy Kaw, the administrative capital of Karenni State. They stopped people at the checkpoint, a whole bunch of different trucks and cars, took the people out, tied up their hands, tortured them, shot them, and then put the bodies back in the cars and the trucks, and then burned all those. More than 40 people were killed, including children, including 2 workers from the Save the Children charity. And for what? And then the military comes out and says, well, these people were trying to, they tried to run the checkpoint and they were shooting back at us. What, with their hands tied? This is the sort of thing that is coming up, and we're seeing more and more of these kind of atrocities. So really, what we're looking at slowly but surely is a sort of Syria-type situation next door to Thailand. But it's not Syria in the sense that you don't have these big powers that are directly engaged. You don't have like Russian troops there. You don't have the US running around with some troops here. You don't have Turkey threatening to come across the border. What has happened is they basically, if everybody's sort of forgotten Burma, left it over in the corner, and let it sort of fight out itself. The international headlines have left. Everybody's paying attention to Ukraine, but some of the same atrocities are happening in Burma, but nobody hears about them or nobody sees them. These are the sort of things that we've seen. And, when you talk about Burma in the West, most people would talk about the situation of the Rohingya. People recognize that the Rohingya back in 2017, faced crimes against humanity and genocide. The US just accused Myanmar of committing genocide against the Rohingya. Over 800,000 people were chased out of the country in the course of 2 months. Over 10,000 people killed, mass rape, mass destruction of settlements, all the sorts of things that the military is doing now to other parts of the country they did against the Rohingya. But people remember the Rohingya and don't pay attention to what's happening now. And so, what happened to the Rohingya really is the sort of just the worst example of the kind of killings, beatings, rape, and sexual violence, forced laboring, forced portering, and wholesale destruction of the villages that the Tatmadaw is capable of committing and is committing now against other places. Coincidentally, and I know I'm running on a bit, but coincidentally, I'll also say that the political space that also existed in the cities on rights issues has also collapsed. So yesterday was World Press Freedom Day. But in Myanmar, the free media has been crushed. More than 135 reporters have been arrested since February 1st, 2021. 53 of them are still in prison. There was just threats from military militias to kill reporters. That was issued yesterday. Freedom of expression is a thing of the past. Police and military formers are back. Any sort of protests are crushed. So what we're seeing is flash mobs in some cities where people really run out with banners and throw leaflets in the air and then disperse. Tortures and killings are back. Growing numbers of political prisoners are back. So, we've really, in the deja vu terms, reverted back to the military yesteryear that we saw before, that existed, and that was really the worst fear of the Myanmar people. Thailand is also engaged in this deja vu, pushing refugees back, adopting the same sort of bad practices that previous Thai governments have done when faced with situations in Myanmar. And, frankly, it looks like, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha and Deputy Prime Minister Pawit Wongsuwan, they're basically close friends and allies of the Burmese generals of the junta. And in some ways, they're repeating deja vu, the role of then Army Commander General Chawalut Yongchayut, who later became Prime Minister as well, where he was a close friend of previous Burmese military dictators as well. So very much of a deja vu to the go along to get along arrangements of past Thai governments with the Myanmar junta. So I think really, I think that by and large, I would say that, the darkest hours before the dawn, and I think that we are going to continue in this darkest hour for a while in Myanmar. International engagement, through ASEAN, others is really not leading anywhere. There's going to be now a big US-ASEAN summit at the White House on May 12th and 13th, where certainly Burma will be discussed, but I'm not expecting any breakthroughs. The Burmese people, I think, have recognized that they can expect some support from the international community. There will be international economic sanctions, there'll be push for arms embargoes and other things that we and others continue to call for. But that really it's on them. That, the Burmese people are going to win it and lose it themselves. They're fighting for their future, and by and large, I think they're going to succeed, but it's going to require quite some time, and there's going to be a lot of suffering between now and then. So I welcome any questions you have, certainly about what is being done now, what the international community could do, and any other issues you want to raise. So thank you very much. Again, thanks to Ren for inviting me, and to all of you for coming out today.
Yeah, look, that was a fantastic talk, and I really acknowledge you for being the perfect wingman for Rose. So obviously, Rose is here to answer questions as well, so anybody has questions for either Phil or Rose, please ask them. Rose is going shy. She's saying, please don't ask me. You want to do the microphone? Put your hand up to ask a question.
We got over there. It's over there.
Whatever happened to Aung Suu Kyi? Is she still in jail?
Yeah, Aung San Suu Kyi is now, she's now been convicted, let's see, she was convicted of illegal possession of walkie-talkies that were brought into the country, that were actually her security services provided by the Ministry of Home Affairs run by the military, but they said it was illegally imported. She's been convicted of violating COVID-19 protocols connected to some sort of campaign rally. And the latest is she was hit with and convicted of bogus corruption charges just about a week ago. So she now has 11 years in prison. And she's got, I think, another 9 charges coming against her. The next one will be Official Secrets Act, violating Official Secrets Act, which can get her another 20 years in prison. What they're planning to do is they're putting, I think the military has recognized that as long as she is free and can campaign, they will always lose the election. So she is being put on ice indefinitely. As far as we can tell, she's being held in some sort of state guest house somewhere in the administrative capital, Naypyidaw. But no one knows exactly where she is or what her conditions of confinement are. Her lawyers have been hit with a gag order, where if they actually say anything publicly about the trial or about her, they would face criminal charges. So, I mean, what they're trying to do is they're out of sight, out of mind. They're just trying to bury her. And my personal view is I don't think we will see her as a free woman again for as long as the military continue to hold power.
Okay, you mentioned Donald Trump. I think he's looking for a job. You know, we'll go with our Myanmar.
Advisor to the junta of Myanmar, all right.
and I'm sorry, another thing is that Rose, you said he used to carry water in Myanmar. Does he still make you carry water? Is he a bad boy?
Every day. You're carrying Ren's water, okay.
Please, can you tell me who is supporting the military in Burma? Because somebody must be supporting them.
It's a good question. The number one arms supplier to Myanmar is China. The number two is Russia.
Is where?
Russia.
Oh my God.
There is actually, it's very interesting, there is a particularly close relationship between Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and the Russian military and Vladimir Putin. Numerous military officials over the past 5 years have been sent to Moscow to train at military academies and other various institutes. On Armed Forces Day, which is March 27th, 2021, on a day where the military killed 163 people across the country, the Deputy Minister of Defense of Russia was the guest of honor in Naypyidaw, the administrative capital of the military, during the big parade and all these things like that. So really China and Russia. I would also say that Thailand is a supporter of the junta, particularly Prime Minister Prayut and Deputy Prime Minister Pawit. I would also say that India has supported Myanmar, in part for their own interests. There's a sort of an arrangement between India and Myanmar. There's insurgents that exist in Myanmar that fight into the eastern part of India. And so there's an arrangement where basically if you take care of our insurgents in your territory, we'll take care of your insurgents in our territory. But that said, it's very interesting. In the western part of Myanmar, in Chin State, that abuts the Indian state of Mizoram. And surprise, surprise, the Mizos are basically Chin, and the Chin are basically Mizos. So they're basically brothers and sisters across the border. So the state government of Mizoram has been very supportive of refugees fleeing in, and they've allowed the kids to go to school and do all these things, which frankly more governments should do when it comes to refugees. But in this case, that state government of Mizoram has not gotten any support from the center, from Delhi.
My question is about the Burmese military. Is it 100% ethnic Burmese, or are they recruiting? Do they recruit different ethnic groups and use them against each other?
Well, it's a good question. They traditionally have recruited from many different ethnic groups, although primarily it's been ethnic Burman. That has been preferred. Now they're facing a major problem, however, because some of the fiercest areas of resistance, where the biggest PDF activities are coming from, are from the traditional recruiting grounds of the Tatmadaw, like in Sagaing. Sagaing, which is in northwest Burma, is basically a state that through all this period of time previously has been sort of quiescent and quiet. This has been a, sort of Burman heartland, nothing really going on here, guys. Don't pay attention to us. And now it is the center of the resistance. So all of a sudden you're asking Myanmar military soldiers to go back into these areas where they're from and go fight against their relatives. Not surprising, there's been a significant number of defections. And, it's also not surprising that the recruitment levels of the Myanmar military have really dropped. So now they're basically trying to go back to the military families and say, okay, you've got to train more people, or you've got to provide more others from your family to join the military, because the Myanmar military is really getting stretched. And that's actually good news, because the more stretched they are, the less damage they can do. But it is a difficulty now for them to recruit people who are from ethnic groups, because the ethnic groups, of course, these are the people who are getting killed.
Partly you answered my question already about India. What about Big Brother China? I don't think China or India is interested in any instability in Burma, regardless whether they sympathize with the junta or not. But and what about Singapore? I think Singapore is a trading partner, and I think they don't have any particular ideology for or against the dictatorship.
You're right about China. China is primarily interested in stability. It's important to recognize that China did not have a problem with Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy governments. Suu Kyi and the NLD were more than supportive of the Chinese economic corridor that is being created in Myanmar. And the idea is that they're going to create an economic corridor that connects Rakhine State to China via a gas pipeline and other various different developments along that corridor. And Aung San Suu Kyi signed a loan agreement under the Belt and Road Initiative to take money to do that. So I think that China was actually a bit dismayed. Like, why are you having a coup? What's broken here? There wasn't a problem. But I think what has happened now is they've realized that in order to maintain and preserve their investment and the possibility of that, they have to basically support the junta. But it's important to recognize that China has always played both sides against the middle in Burma, because China is also the major supporter of the Northern Alliance. And the Northern Alliance are the four ethnic groups that in the north who have been continually opposed against the Tatmadaw. That's the United Wa State Army, the Kachin Independence Army, the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, and the Arakan Army, which was actually fostered and trained by the KIA and now is basically operating in Rakhine State, but also has troops that fight alongside the KIA in Kachin State. And if there were not an open Chinese border for those areas, those ethnic groups would not be able to survive. And the reality is that Tatmadaw hates the fact that there are no-go areas, for instance, in the United Wa State Army area, which is area that is completely off limits to the Tatmadaw. They haven't been there in those areas in 2 decades. And this is resented by the Tatmadaw. So, China uses these ethnic armies as a hedge for good behavior by the Tatmadaw. It's typical, like, sort of China big politics games. And the other side is that also China discreetly talks behind the scenes with ethnic groups and organizations and the NUG people via Kunming, You know, they basically have a group of people in Yunnan province who are sort of the back channel to Beijing for the opposition. So, you know, China is making sure that whatever happens, they end up on the winning side, and their interests are preserved. As far as Singapore, the problem about Singapore is basically the banking capital for the military of Myanmar. And so actually real action could be taken against their assets if we could persuade Singapore to act. And actually the US government has gone and talked to Singapore about this, and the fact that nothing's happened indicates, I think, that Singapore's not prepared to do something. But on the other hand, Singapore has been quite aggressive towards Burma in ASEAN because they think that Burma's wrecking it all. You know, Singapore has a great deal of interest in a functioning ASEAN. As a small state, they want to be part of a larger collective that is protective to them. They also tend to play ASEAN like a fiddle. You know, they're very astute diplomats, and they're able to get what they want out of ASEAN all the time. But now, ASEAN has to spend all its time trying to sort out Burma. And, you know, and they can't do all these other things. And every time the European Union or the US or others go talk to ASEAN, they want to talk about Burma. They don't want to talk about some growth agenda or some other project that Singapore wants. They want to talk about Burma. And so Singapore is pissed off because Burma's wrecked it. They wrecked the party.
I've been to Myanmar 3 times. I love the place. I feel more at home in Myanmar than I do in Australia. Of course, I haven't been there for 40 years, much. Phil, there are solutions. Why they're not being used?
Well, I think there's I think right now there's still a lack of political commitment from the military in Myanmar to recognize that they're going to have to negotiate. The international community hasn't torqued up the pressure strong enough to basically make it really hurt. You've got China and Russia defending Myanmar at the UN Security Council, which makes it impossible for us to get a global arms embargo, which we want, or a referral of Myanmar to the International Criminal Court on crimes against humanity, which would be something that would hurt. So, I mean, right now we're kind of stymied. And the fact that the international headlines have moved off Burma to Ukraine and other places also means that policymakers can sort of say, oh yeah, we're concerned about Burma, but you know, we've got something other we have to work on. The biggest example of this is what the constant refrain we hear from the Australian government, it's going to drive me crazy, but also from the EU, from the US and others, who basically say, oh, Burma is a big problem, but we believe in ASEAN centrality, and therefore ASEAN needs to take the lead in solving it. ASEAN is probably the least capable international organization to resolve a situation like Burma. And beyond that, they're split right down the middle. So on one hand, you have Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, and to a lesser extent Brunei, being willing to be more aggressive. And the foreign minister of Malaysia just admitted that he met with the NUG, which of course made the Tatmadaw and the junta in Burma very angry. And then on the other side, you have Thailand, Cambodia, which is the ASEAN chair, Laos and Vietnam, where attitudes are basically like, well, it's very unfortunate what's happening there, but it's none of our business, and let them sort it out themselves. And plus, you know, Min Aung Hlaing, he's not such a bad guy after all. And, you know, those two are split right down the middle. You know, and so there's the Philippines, if anything, is sort of on the side of the Malaysian, the Singaporean grouping, although it really doesn't care that much. So there's no way to move forward.
UN.
The UN right now, I mean, there's been UN General Assembly resolution, which was very strong. There's been actions at the Human Rights Council. But the UN Security Council, because two of the veto-wielding members, China and Russia, are blocking the way, We're in the same place that we were with like Syria. Except what's happened is instead of, in Syria at least you would have people bring up a resolution and forced Russia and China to defend the indefensible. What we've said is to Britain, which is the pen holder for any resolution on Myanmar at the UN Security Council, it's like, come on guys, go for it. You know, it's not like by not trying to pressure to do something, you're getting something done here. You know, you're just giving them a free ride. With, you know, they've got a pocket veto. They're saying, well, we'll use the veto. Well, make them use it then. Make them defend the indefensible in Myanmar. Make them get up in front of the international news media and say why they think Min Aung Hlaing and what the Tatmadaw are doing to the Burmese people is okay. But they haven't done it. So, I mean, we keep pressuring Britain. We say, you guys should do something. Britain keeps saying, well, we still got a consensus. And we say, yeah, you've got a consensus to do nothing.
Very sad. Thank you.
Yeah.
A huge round of applause for our two speakers about this hugely important subject. That was kind of... So, of course, we do have...
I like Rose better.
That's just... It's just because he's a very handsome man, sexy man, I think so, you know. Phil, thank you so much for coming. And what he said about, you know, the international attention has been drawn to the Ukraine, understandably, of course. And we can't let things like Myanmar go under the radar. And thank God, literally, for organisations like Human Rights Watch and the efforts of people like Phil. And a small token of our huge appreciation, Phil.